250 days. That is how long it took the German war machine to break Sevastopol the first time. From the autumn of 1941 to the height of summer in 1942, the finest siege army Germany could assemble hammered this one Soviet city on the Black Sea coast. They brought up a railway gun so enormous it needed a crew of 1,000 men just to feed it, an 800mm monster that fired shells the size of small cars. They burned through nearly 50,000 tons of ammunition, and when the smoking ruin finally fell, the general who took it, Erich von Manstein, walked away with a field marshal's baton as his prize. That was 1942. By the spring of 1944, the Red Army would undo all of it in 35 days. Not 35 days to lay siege, 35 days to clear the entire Crimean peninsula, smash through every fortress line the Germans had built, and erase the German 17th Army from the map as a fighting force. Sapun Ridge to the heart of Sevastopol took the Soviets 2 days. 2. The same ground that had cost the Wehrmacht the better part of a year. This is the story of how the hunter became the hunted, how more than 200,000 German and Romanian soldiers got themselves trapped on a peninsula with the sea at their backs and the Red Army closing in from every direction, and how it ended on a wind-swept cape at the far western tip of Crimea, with thousands of men drowning in the surf and tens of thousands more throwing down their rifles. The near exact reversal of 1942. Let us get into how it happened. Crimea, late 1943. To understand the trap, you have to understand the map. Crimea is a peninsula, a great diamond of land hanging off the southern edge of what is now Ukraine, connected to the mainland by only the thinnest of threads. In the north, there is the Perekop Isthmus, a strip of dry land barely a few miles wide, blocked across its neck by an ancient earthwork the Russians have called the Turkish Wall for centuries. Beside it sits the Sivash, a shallow lagoon of stinking salt water and mud that the locals call the Putrid Sea. In the east, the Kerch Peninsula reaches out toward the Russian mainland like a pointing finger. Those are the only ways in. Those are the only ways out. By the autumn of 1943, the wider war on the Eastern Front had already turned. The Red Army had won at Stalingrad. It had won the largest tank battle in history at Kursk. It had retaken Kiev and was rolling the German front line back toward the west like a carpet. And in doing so, it had run straight past Crimea, cutting the land bridge to the mainland and slamming the door shut behind the German 17th Army. The 17th Army was not a small force. It was around 230,000 men, roughly 165,000 Germans, stiffened by around 65,000 Romanian troops, part of Army Group South Ukraine. A few months earlier, they had been part of the great offensive dreams of the German High Command. Now they were a garrison on an island, supplied only by sea and air, sitting on ground the rest of the army had already abandoned. And they were not even safe in the interior, because the wooded mountains of southern Crimea were thick with Soviet partisans who ambushed convoys, cut roads, and made sure the occupiers never slept easy. Any sane commander would have pulled the garrison out, get them across the water, back to the main front, where 250,000 trained men could plug a gap or anchor a line. The 17th Army's own commander, a hard-faced general named Erwin Janicke, understood this perfectly. He spent the winter quietly begging Berlin to let him evacuate while there was still time. But the order came down from the very top. Hold Crimea, hold it at all costs. Adolf Hitler had convinced himself that the peninsula was a shield protecting the Romanian oil fields, that losing it would push Romania and Bulgaria towards switching sides, that Fortress Crimea must stand. So the 17th Army stayed. They dug in across the old siege lines, mined the approaches, strung their wire, and waited. They were waiting for the exact thing that was about to destroy them. On the other side of the Sivash, the Red Army was building a hammer. The job of cracking Crimea open went to the 4th Ukrainian Front, commanded by Army General Fyodor Tolbukhin, a heavy-set, methodical man who planned the way a surgeon plans a long operation. Tolbukhin would strike from the north, through Perekop and across the lagoon. From the east, out of the Kerch bridgehead, came the separate coastal army, by this point under Lieutenant General Kondrat Melnik, who had taken over the eastern command just before the blow fell. Overhead and offshore, the Black Sea Fleet and the Azov flotilla stood ready to turn the surrounding water into a killing ground. The numbers tell you which way this was going to go. The Soviets massed around 462,000 men. They brought up 560 tanks and assault guns, 6,000 artillery pieces, and 1,200 aircraft. Against the dug-in 230,000 of the 17th Army, that is the kind of crushing local superiority that turns a battle into a foregone conclusion before the first shot is even fired. And here is where the story turns from numbers into sheer nerve. For weeks, the Soviet engineers had been doing something half-mad and entirely brilliant. They were building roads across the Sivash itself. Through that shallow, freezing, salt-poisoned lagoon, men waded chest-deep in water that ate at their skin and rotted their boots, carrying timber and stone on their shoulders by night. They laid causeways and pontoon bridges across the mud, and over them they dragged whole divisions and even tanks to a bridgehead on the far shore, right on the German flank. The work went on under artillery fire, in the dark, in water cold enough to kill a man who stopped moving. The Germans knew the crossings were there. They simply could not believe anyone would push an army through that muck. They were about to learn. The clock started on the 8th of April, 1944, and the Germans had far less time than they thought. The opening barrage came down like the end of the world. Across the Perekop Isthmus and the Sivash bridgehead, thousands of Soviet guns opened up at the same moment, a wall of fire that chewed the German forward trenches into raw earth and threw up a curtain of smoke and dust that blotted out the morning. The bombardment ran for over 2 hours, walking back and forth across the German lines before it lifted. Then came the infantry of the 2nd Guards Army at Perekop and the 51st Army out of the Sivash bridgehead, swarming forward across that narrow neck of land. The fighting on the first day was brutal. The Perekop position was old ground, fortified in layers behind the Turkish wall, and the German and Romanian defenders did not simply fold. They fought from concrete bunkers and trench lines that had been improved all winter, raking the open ground with machine gun fire, calling down their own artillery on the advancing Soviet companies. The little town of Armyansk, in the throat of the isthmus, changed hands in vicious close-quarters fighting, house by house, cellar by cellar. But the weight coming down on them was simply too great, and the Soviet plan did not just push at the front door. The divisions that had crossed the Sivash now drove in hard from the flank, threatening to cut the whole Perekop garrison off from behind. That is the detail that broke the German line wide open. A defender holding a narrow front can bleed an attacker for a long time, but the moment that defender sees an enemy column swinging around behind him, the math changes. Stay and be encircled, or run and live. Within a couple of days, the northern defences were buckling, and the 17th Army began to peel back from the isthmus it had been ordered to hold to the last man, abandoning the very wall that had stopped armies for 500 years. And then the eastern door swung open too. On the 11th of April, the separate coastal army broke out of the Kerch bridgehead and liberated the city of Kerch itself. The German 5th Corps, holding the east, now had Melnik's troops driving into them from one side, and the certain knowledge that the entire northern front was collapsing behind them. There was nothing to do but retreat, and retreat fast, west across the peninsula, toward the only place left that might be defensible, toward Sevastopol. What followed was not a fighting withdrawal, it was a race, and the Red Army was winning it. This next part is what turned a defeat into a catastrophe. When an army retreats in good order, it leapfrogs backward, one unit holding while another falls back, trading ground for time. But the Soviet advance was moving so fast with mobile columns of tanks and motorized infantry punching down the open roads of the central Crimean steppe, that the Germans and Romanians could not set their feet anywhere. Mobile groups raced ahead of the main force to seize crossroads and rail junctions before the retreating enemy could use them. Every time the Germans tried to form a new line, Soviet armour was already past their flank. Simferopol, the Crimean capital in the heart of the peninsula, fell on the 13th of April, only 5 days into the offensive. The port of Yevpatoria, the resort coast around Yalta, the whole interior of Crimea was gone in barely a week. For the men of the 17th Army, the roads west became a nightmare. Columns jammed bumper to bumper on the few good highways, strafed and bombed from above by those 1,200 Soviet aircraft that now owned the sky completely. Vehicles burning, horses screaming, men scattering into the fields with every fresh pass of the fighters. The Romanian and German units were tangling together, command breaking down, the neat unit boundaries on the staff maps dissolving into one long, desperate stream of traffic heading for the coast. And along the mountain roads, the partisans came down out of the woods to fall on the stragglers. Anyone who has studied a rout knows the shape of it. So yeah, not great for the 17th Army. And here is the part that still stings for the German side. They were running towards Sevastopol because Sevastopol was the great fortress, the prize that had cost them 250 days of siege in 1942. Surely, they thought, behind those famous defences they could hold. They could anchor on the high ground, dig in, and make the Soviets pay the same terrible price the Germans had once paid. It was a fantasy. The defences that had taken so long to crack in 1942 had been built and manned by a determined Soviet garrison with months to prepare and the will to die in place. What stumbled back into Sevastopol in the spring of 1944 was a beaten, exhausted, half-organised mass of men who had been running and dying for 2 weeks straight, who had left their heavy guns and their wounded scattered along 100 miles of road behind them. The fortress was the same. The defenders were not. Now, while all of this was unfolding on land, something else was breaking down out on the water. Berlin had finally, far too late, given grudging partial permission to start pulling men out by sea. The Romanian Navy, which carried the bulk of the load, called the effort Operation 60,000, named for the rough number of Romanian troops they were trying to save. And for a while, it actually moved a lot of men. Between the middle of April and the middle of May, the sea lift carried something like 120,000 men and over 22,000 tons of cargo away from the Crimean shore, convoy after convoy slipping out for the Romanian ports across the water. But an evacuation by sea only works if you control the sea and the air above it. The Germans and Romanians controlled neither. Every transport that pulled away from the coast had to run a gauntlet of Soviet submarines lying in wait, torpedo boats darting in by night, and above all, aircraft circling like gulls over the convoy lanes. The ships went out crammed far beyond capacity with desperate men, low in the water, slow, and too many of them never reached the far shore. We will come back to the water, because the water is where the worst of it happened. If you are getting something out of this breakdown of how the Red Army avenged Sevastopol, take a second to subscribe. We dig into the forgotten corners of the Eastern Front every week, the battles that decided the war, but rarely get told from the side that actually won them. By the end of April, the entire 17th Army that still survived was packed into the Sevastopol perimeter, backs to the sea, the 4th Ukrainian Front and the separate coastal army closing in around them in a tightening ring. Tolbukin did not rush the final assault. He had learned the lessons of 100 earlier battles, and he brought his guns forward, stockpiled shells, brought up fresh ammunition over those same isthmus roads, lined up his armies, and got everything precisely in place. The Germans inside the pocket could only watch the Soviet artillery parks grow and grow along the ridgelines and understand exactly what was coming. Inside the German command, the argument over evacuation finally exploded. Jaenicke, the army commander, had been right all along, and he knew it. He pushed once more, hard, to abandon the city and get his surviving men onto ships before the noose closed completely. Holding Sevastopol now was pure madness, a city about to become a death trap with no exit but the sea. On the 3rd of May, Hitler's answer arrived. Jaenicke was sacked, relieved of command for the crime of wanting to save his own soldiers. In his place came General Karl Allmendinger, handed the impossible job of defending a fortress that could not be defended, with an army that no longer existed in any real sense. It would not save a single life. It would cost thousands. The final Soviet assault opened on the 5th of May. For 2 days the attack ground forward against the outer ring, the defenders fighting from the same heights and ravines that had figured in the Great Siege 2 years before. Every gully registered, every approach mined. The Germans and Romanians knew the value of this ground. They knew that the key to the whole position was a long, steep wall of rock to the southeast of the city, rising sharp above the valley floor, Sapun Ridge. Sapun Ridge was the lock on the door. As long as the Germans held that high ground, with its tiers of trenches and pillboxes cut into the slope, they held Sevastopol. Whoever took the ridge took the city. In 1942, fighting over these same heights had dragged on through the worst of the siege. On the 7th of May, the 51st Army of the 4th Ukrainian Front went straight up it. The assault on Sapun Ridge is the moment the whole revenge mirror snaps into focus. Soviet infantry climbing that brutal slope under a storm of fire, hauling themselves from one shell crater to the next, machine gunners going to ground, while assault groups with grenades and flamethrowers worked along the German trench lines. Banner teams raced for the crest, men cut down carrying the flags forward, and others snatching them up to keep them moving. Overhead, the ground attack aircraft worked the German positions over and over, while the massed Soviet artillery walked its fire just ahead of the climbing riflemen. By the end of the day, the ridge was Soviet ground. The red banners stood on the crest. The lock was broken. And once Sapun Ridge fell, everything the Germans had built came apart in hours, not weeks. Remember what it had cost the Wehrmacht to reach this same point in 1942. Now the Red Army stood on the decisive height after a single day's assault, with the city laid out below them and a shattered enemy with nowhere left to run. The Soviets did not pause to savour it. They poured down off the ridge and into Sevastopol itself, fighting through the rubble of streets the Germans had themselves wrecked 2 years earlier. On the 9th of May 1944, the city was liberated. Less than a month after the offensive began, less than 2 years to the day after the Germans had hauled their giant guns up to batter their way in, the great Black Sea fortress was back in Soviet hands. The Black Sea Fleet had its main base again. The red flag was back over the harbour. For the 17th Army, the fall of the city was not the end. It was the beginning of the worst part. Because there was still nowhere to go. The survivors who streamed out of Sevastopol did not flee inland. They could not. The Red Army held the whole peninsula behind them. They went the only direction left, west, out onto a barren spit of land at the very tip of Crimea. Cape Chersonese, a flat, exposed finger of rock and scrub reaching into the Black Sea, ringed by water on almost every side, with an old lighthouse standing at the end of it. The end of the road, in the most literal sense. Around 30,000 men crowded onto that cape in the second week of May. 30,000 soldiers of a once proud army, jammed into a shrinking perimeter behind a last thin line of trenches scratched into the rock, staring out at the sea and praying for the ships that were supposed to come. Some ships did come, not nearly enough. The men on the shore fought among themselves to reach the boats, formed desperate queues at the water's edge, waded out to be hauled aboard, watched the Soviet artillery creep closer and the perimeter shrink by the hour. Discipline frayed and then snapped. Officers lost control of their own men. The water around Cape Chersonese became a graveyard, and the 10th of May was its darkest day. Two large transport ships, the Totila and the Teja, came in to lift men off the Cape. They loaded to bursting. Thousands of soldiers packed onto each deck and crammed into every hold, and turned back out to sea, riding low and slow under the weight. Soviet aircraft found them both. In the course of that single day, both ships were bombed and sunk in the open water. The estimates of the dead run as high as 10,000 men, drowned or killed in the space of a few hours, sent to the bottom of the Black Sea, within sight of the shore they had been trying to escape. Picture 2 ocean liners worth of soldiers, gone between one sunrise and the next. That is the kind of number that does not really fit in the head, and the Totila and the Teja were only the headline. Across the whole evacuation, the German and Romanian merchant fleet was bled white. The Germans lost 5 cargo ships, a tanker, 3 tugs, 3 lighters, 3 motorboats, and 4 submarine chasers. The Romanians lost 3 more cargo ships. Vessel after vessel torpedoed, bombed or shelled, each one taking its load of men down with it. Operation 60,000 had started as an orderly sea lift. It ended as a slaughter on the water. The supposed lifeline turned into the deepest grave of the whole campaign. By the morning of the 12th of May, it was over. The Cape Chersonese pocket, that last 30,000, was overrun. There was no grand last stand, no fighting to the last bullet. There was a flat, crowded spit of land, with the Red Army on one side and the empty sea on the other, and no ships coming. The men simply put their hands up. Around 21,000 were taken prisoner when the Cape fell, the survivors of an army that had been ordered to fight to the death for a peninsula its own generals had begged to abandon. 35 days. From the first barrage on the Perekop Isthmus on the 8th of April to the surrender on Cape Chersonese on the 12th of May, the whole of Crimea cleared. Now, line the 2 campaigns up side by side, because that is the whole point. In 1942, the German 11th Army needed 250 days of siege and the better part of 50,000 tons of shells to take Sevastopol, and the victory was so prized that it made Erich von Manstein a field marshal. In 1944, the Red Army took back the entire peninsula in 35 days and broke into Sevastopol itself in a matter of days once Sapun Ridge fell. The same ground, the opposite result. A near-perfect reversal, run backward, at a fraction of the time. Count the cost on the German and Romanian side. The Crimean offensive cost the Axis around 96,700 men in total. On the German side alone, roughly 31,700 killed or missing, and another 33,400 wounded. The Romanians lost around 25,800 killed or missing, and another 5,800 wounded. And across the whole campaign, something like 61,000 men passed into Soviet captivity. The 17th Army, that 250,000-strong garrison, was gone. About half its strength killed or drowned, the rest marched off into the prisoner columns. As a fighting force, it had simply ceased to exist. The Soviets paid too. Cracking those fortified isthmuses and storming Sapun Ridge was never going to be cheap. The Red Army lost around 84,000 men in the operation, of whom nearly 18,000 were killed or missing. Nobody should pretend that ground came free. But set that against an entire enemy army annihilated, the most famous fortress on the Black Sea retaken, and a whole peninsula liberated in 5 weeks, and the verdict writes itself. The consequences ran far beyond Crimea. The Black Sea Fleet had its great base back, which meant Soviet sea power on that whole flank was reborn overnight. The loss of 250,000 men, and the manner of that loss, the drownings, the abandoned army, the generals overruled from Berlin, sent a shudder through Germany's allies. Romania had just watched tens of thousands of its sons sent to the bottom of the sea for a peninsula that meant nothing to Romanian survival. Within a few months, Romania would switch sides entirely and turn its guns on its former German partners. Hitler's nightmare, the very thing he claimed he was holding Crimea to prevent, came true precisely because he had insisted on holding Crimea. Go back to where we started. 250 days, a railway gun crewed by 1,000 men, 50,000 tons of shells, a field marshal's baton. That was the price the German war machine once paid to take Sevastopol, and they called it a triumph for the ages. 2 years later, the Red Army handed the whole bill back, with interest, in 35 days, and left 250,000 men dead, drowned, or in chains, on a peninsula their own commanders had pleaded to leave. The hunter of 1942 became the hunted of 1944. That is what revenge looks like when an army has the strength to take it. If this is the kind of Eastern Front story you want more of, the battles where the Red Army did the destroying and the Wehrmacht did the dying, the video on screen is waiting for you. Go watch it now.